Great. So, hello everyone, and thanks for being with us despite the Zoom fatigue. Maria and I are going to talk today about how people tried to make games based on Andrzej Sapkowski's literary Witcher universe before it was cool. That is to say, before the year 2007 or before the premiere, the release of the first Witcher game by CD Projekt. You can see in the slide that we're starting from 1990, not from 1994 as the program would suggest. This is because this is to some extent a progressing project, and I guess we're not entirely sure about the starting point yet. There are many possibilities. We'll probably get back to that later on. And I'd like to start by some quotations from this article from Polygon, because I think it expresses succinctly some things that are pretty important to us. The piece says that CD Projekt Red was founded in 1994 by Iwiński and his then business partner Michał Kiciński. Marcin Iwiński developed a relationship with game publisher Interplay and began networking with game companies and attending events around the world. In one case, he met Bioware founders and pitched them on localizing the popular RPG Baldur's Gate for Polish audiences. Then it turned out that CDPR had to rent a separate warehouse just to hold copies of Baldur's Gate before it shipped. Ultimately, the team would sell tens of thousands of units of the game, a blockbuster by the standards of the time. The project was so successful that the team immediately began another, a PC port of the Baldur's Gate sequel, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, for the company Interplay. There was only one catch: Interplay was falling apart. Then CD Projekt began discussing what it could do with the code it had developed as part of the Dark Alliance port, now that the game itself was no longer going to be released. With the content of the game now completely up to the Polish developers, it turned immediately to Sapkowski's The Witcher. So here we have both Baldur's Gate and The Witcher. We have very important titles. We have big steps in the history of video games. And that's precisely what we're not going to talk about today. But we wanted to present this narrative to start from it because it's a pretty significant one. In the next slide, you will see that we're not going to reject this narrative, let's call it perhaps a dominant narrative. We're not going to reject it in its entirety, but we're going to present another narrative. This one, the one from Polygon, and also echoed a bit in Konrad Budziszewski's piece on Poland in video games around the world. This one was what Jako Słomnin might probably call enthusiast history, focusing on big titles, the origins of big titles, preferably relations to other big titles, and so on. This is probably particularly pronounced with regard to peripheral or semi-peripheral video game markets, and certainly the Polish video game market was at least semi-peripheral in the 1990s. We don't dismiss the enthusiast narrative, but we are more interested here today in another one. And what we're doing is in many ways similar to what Riccardo Fassone did in his article Chameleon Attack of the Mutant Camels. We are indebted to Riccardo Fassone, in fact, in several methodological matters. In the upper part of the screen, you can now see a quotation that was partly chosen because of the fact that it allows me to try to pronounce such words as unequivocal, teleological, and vicissitudes, which is always a nice thing to try to do. But other than that, Fassone expresses pretty nicely the point that central trends in video game historiography seem to look for a line from start to finish, to focus on a line from start to finish. And if we look at video game history, or any history for that matter, in such a linear way, we may fail to grasp the often chaotic nature of video game production, of video culture, of culture in general. In this paper, like Fassone does, we aim at eschewing the exercise of canonizing power. We're focusing on smaller scale phenomena. We're focusing on lower intensity processes and practices, so to speak, instead of big titles, big relationships between the big titles, and so on. And that's roughly a methodological approach here. After that, we're going to talk a bit about Andrzej Sapkowski and his Witcher universe, and then we will discuss several games, some of which you may not know, and not all of which actually exist. We focus on context, not on content, although there are studies focused on content of the games, such as Wallin's on Lord of the Rings adaptations or Schretter's on Game of Thrones adaptations. And we borrow the word variantology from Ricardo Fassone again. We use variantology in two senses. First, we don't attempt to describe the one true version of video game history, just one of the variants, one of the histories, so to speak. And in another sense, we will attempt to show cultural history not as linear history, but as branching history, a history of variants, a history that includes unfinished projects, unsuccessful games, forgotten games, maybe even dead ends. We're basing that on an analysis of publications, including archival research, on oral history, on a little bit of investigative journalism, trying to look for bits of information here and there on the internet or in conversations with game developers and so on. And that's that.
Okay, so you're investigative journalist. All right. So some, general points about the Sapkowski universe and that you may not know, just to remind you. So Andrzej Sapkowski is a Polish science fiction and fantasy writer, born in Łódź, where I'm actually from. He also finished my alma mater. And in the 1980s, he worked as this kind of senior representative for sales for a foreign company. But he decided to send for a contest at the science fiction and fantasy magazine, Polish magazine called Fantastica, about which actually Staszek wrote his PhD to a certain extent. He decided to write this short story called The Witcher, and the story got only third prize, but it was very popular. And Sapkowski continued his work as a writer and created 2 books with short stories, then a series of books, 5, then there was like in the 90s basically. From 1993 to 1999, the so-called Witcher series, basically, the big saga. And then after a break in 2013, again, a small series of short stories. But when it gets really exciting and kind of it resonates with the subject of our conference, and the transnational histories, the moment are the translations. So the earliest translations of Sapkowski's work are coming from Czech Republic because of the connections between the fandoms, even in the 1980s during the communist times. So first the Czech translations, then Russians, and then it kind of got more and more popular. You can see on the covers reference to video games. With the popularity of the CD Projekt video games, you got even more translations. And now with the popularity of the Netflix series, for example, in the far bottom right corner, you have the Chinese-Taiwanese translation, which is promoted next to the Netflix series. Another important part of the context here are early adaptations in other media, and we are speaking here about Poland, of course. So one thing, graphic novels, there were like 6 books. One of them actually co-written by Sapkowski, so the storyline is a part of the canon, so to speak. And then the famous and famous movie and the TV series. So the movie was pretty bad, like famously bad, and it actually did a lot of damage in many ways to the perception of of the possible Witcher franchise. For example, for several the first iterations of the CD Projekt game were not using Geralt as a main character because the designers thought that, you know, no one wants to see Geralt again after the flop of the movie. But yeah, that's you know, that's a very long story. But I think the TV series is worth watching. So we prepared this timeline of selected ludic adaptations, what we are specifically interested in our presentation. Staszek will talk about the RPG games from 1990 and 2001. And then I will speak about most of the other games, apart from the LARP from 2005, which we didn't manage to contact the organizers or participants. We just know it happened. It was a very huge event in Russia. So back to Staszek.
Yes, briefly, Oko Irhedesa, or The Ivor Hades, is a role-playing game written by Sapkowski himself. It had its first release in 1990 in the magazine Phoenix, then in 1994 in Magia Miecz, or Magic and Sword, and then in 1995 it was published in book form to be republished in 1999. It might be interesting to note that Sapkowski was a role-playing game master, much like George R.R. Martin, and the game itself does not contain many other references to the Witcher universe. It doesn't seem to have had any major impact on later games, but still it was significant in its own right. One of the reasons for that was that there were very few RPG systems available in Poland at the time. Another role-playing game was called Gra Wyobraźni, or rather Game of Imagination in English terms. It was focused on narrative to a much higher extent than the Ivor Hades was. And it was also tied up pretty strongly with the film and the movie, the film and the series that Maria has just talked about. For instance, the cover photo has been taken from those things. Here was one moment when we had a role-playing game, a film, a series, we even had a mobile phone game, and it seemed for a moment that maybe, just maybe, there would be an international franchise, but for various reasons, possibly aesthetic ones, among other things, that franchise failed. Well, it did succeed some years later.
Yeah, and the TV series was actually very popular in Czech Republic again. Sapkowski is very popular there. Okay, so Witcher by Metropolis Software, with the director Adrian Chmielarz, one of the most famous characters probably in Polish game dev, author nowadays of Witchfire, which is coming pretty soon, I think, and in 2000s, Painkiller, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, not so long ago. So that was one of his projects in the 90s when he was working for Metropolis Software, and the project was licensed. It was based on the stories, but it never really got past early development. What we know to this point is mostly from press release from the era, and some excellent, actually, amateur historian job did by Arech N, YouTube channel. So they even recreated, you can see that here, they even recreated how the mechanics of the fight would look like, even though it never kind of was realized. But yeah, I just suggest to watch this documentary that is on YouTube, White Wolf, about the Witcher made by this channel. It's very good. So yeah, I think it's basically the most famous unrealized project in Polish history of game dev, of course, basically because of the success of The Witcher as a kind of antithesis of that. And in the far right corner, you can see how it's often described in various narratives in various magazines. So this title says basically Fallen Witchers. Another example is the Mad Ishtar domain. So basically a very kind of typical multi-user dungeon. On the right side, you can see how the client looks nowadays. On the left side, you can see one of the early maps from the 90s. It was hugely popular around 2002. It had like 20,000 characters registered. Yeah, and here is a good moment, speaking of the maps, about the different influence between the different games and the fandom of that era. So basically how the maps for the Witcher game, the CD Projekt game were created. They were heavily influenced, of course, by earlier work done by fandom. You have this early map from 1999 on the left, then you have a Russian map influenced by the one on the left, and then you have a Czech map created actually by the translator of the Czech translations of the Witcher series, which was considered at the time in the early 2000s one of the best maps, and heavily influenced the map for the Witcher game, which was created by Karol Kowalczyk, who was actually connected to the Arcadia MAD. So all those kind of earlier works on the geography in the earlier projects added up, and also in the kind of transnational context, added up to the topography of the Witcher game. Then we don't know really much about this text game, SMS game from 2002. Hopefully we will be able to track down with our investigative journalism skills the authors, but so far we only know very little. So there it is. And then another multi-user dungeon, which is sort of a clone of Arcadia. They released Arcadia code in 2004, if I remember well. And then at that time, many maps were created, and one of the fun projects was this Vatgern, which means in one of the languages from the Sapkowski universe, Witcher. It was a long-term project, but it only kind of worked for 2 years, so kind of collapsed. There was, I guess, maybe enough of similar projects like Arcadia really kind of filled that niche. But it was also an interesting and a different take on the adaptation, and more kind of literary to the works of Sapkowski, where you're trying to be more accurate in the adaptation, faithful. That's the word I should use. And those are kind of selected melodic adaptations. There were other, including some. Well, of course, Flash soft porn games, why not? But maybe we will talk about that in the article. So back to Staszek.
In conclusion, there are at least 3 types of stories that could be told using the examples of these and other games. First, we have tried to show, and other ways could be shown, how some of these games could be placed within the context of the later success of CD Projekt. For instance, it could be said that the film and the series had a two-sided effect. In some ways, maybe detrimental. In other ways, they did increase the popularity. So that's the popularity of The Witcher in wider consciousness. So that's one type of story you could tell. Another type of story you could tell is that of particular works, and maybe even of all those games together, taken as roughly autonomous projects, taken as stories, taken as works that are less successful, less remembered, maybe almost entirely forgotten, but they were here. In the very anthology history, they were here. And finally, each of its games is part of a story of its respective genre and fandom. For instance, the role-playing games, the tabletop games, Irides I and Game of Imagination, could also be discussed as part of the story of the Polish fandom of tabletop role-playing games. And we'll be trying to say more about each of these three stories in the written version of the paper. For now, I guess it's time to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for another absolutely fascinating paper.